We have Journeys into the Unknown by Richard Palmisano, a Canadian investigator. 101 Ways to Find a Ghost by Melissa Martin Ellis, an American investigator. First, Richard Palmisano's Journeys into the Unknown. Mysterious Canadian Encounters with the Paranormal. This was published in 2006. It was published by Dundurn Press. And if you're a Canadian watching this, I suggest checking out Dundurn's website, as not only can you find other books like Palmisano's, but they also put out when they're looking for new manuscripts. So if you have an interest in writing or you have an idea and they're looking for Canadian content, be sure to check into their website regularly. In the front, there's a quote, "How poor the skeptic is when one realizes that all the people in this world who have had some sort of paranormal experience now believe, and all those who have not yet had such an experience know someone who has." It's an interesting concept because, of course, the skeptics will tell you there's no such thing. There's, of course, always a different explanation. There are people out there, the parapsychologists and others, who are doing research and investigations to find out what the paranormal is. And if you've seen my earlier video where I talk about the definitions that I go by, the paranormal is defined as something not yet explained by science. On the back, this fascinating and blood-curdling book takes the reader through a collection of amazing ghost stories and paranormal investigations across Ontario that have never before been reported. The circumstances behind 15 unusual cases of hauntings and ghostly manifestations are explored together with the detailed sagas of full-scale investigations into 6 further spooky, inexplainable occurrences in or near Toronto. The book concludes with a look into the complete investigation of a haunting, including a guide that explains the techniques used to conduct a paranormal investigation. The final section explains some theories behind what a ghost is, how they manifest, and where they hide, challenging the classic theories of life after death research. So turn on all the lights, keep your back to the wall, and be prepared to take a journey into the unknown. I read this book last year and I very much enjoyed it. The first part, as he says, talks about different ghost stories. It goes into detail about what to include on an investigation. The introduction pulls you in. So we have your mind is racing, trying to remember the layout beyond the door, and more importantly, the location of the nearest light switch. The stories revolving around this house spiral through your brain, and you know that according to your preliminary investigation, something lurks in there, in the dark, beyond that switch, waiting and watching with unknown intentions. You proceed inside with caution, looking for light switches, knowing that you are the trespasser. For whatever lingers here lived and died in this house long before you came onto the scene. It's a very interesting take, considering yourself the trespasser. And that's not referring to, and a number of people typically do that, is go onto properties where it's clearly posted you shouldn't be. But the concept of being a trespasser, as in you're going into someone else, something else's space. I believe it's also important to keep that perspective in mind when you're trying to contact spirits. Be respectful. The space that you're going into is not your space, it's theirs. And if you're wanting some kind of a contact or connection, unlike some of these people who I see becoming very belligerent and disrespectful, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you think it makes sense to try and piss something off you don't understand? Do you think it's necessary in terms of the type of energy you're generating, and that's how you're going to get a spirit, what have you, to speak to you? Or do you think it's more important to be respectful and be mindful of whatever it is you're trying to contact? On page 13, and I believe this is extremely important, the author says, the bottom line is time. Time to investigate means being persistent and staying on one case as long as possible, with constant surveillance and attempts at interaction. Our actions at the location of a haunting will energize their interest and excite their emotions, which in time will allow them to manifest and attempt to communicate with us, bringing us ever closer to the answers we seek. For me, that's key on determining clickbait versus real paranormal investigators on YouTube. One group that I've noticed who do return to the same location several times are the Ouija brothers. And I appreciate that because, and even they've mentioned it in their videos, by going back, you're familiar with the location, you get to know the different sounds because every house, building, what have you, has its unique sounds. And particularly at night, when things are quieter, you don't have people moving around as much. So, for example, people who investigate pubs, you would want to do that when the customers aren't there, obviously, because you're going to have different sounds, different things stand out. The same with a house. If you're investigating a house, the only people who should be in there are the investigators, and you should know where they are and what's going on. On page 164, and this continues with the concept of time, true investigative work is just that, work. It is long hours of historical research, going to archives and libraries, scanning miles of old newspapers, searching out the history of the house and property, interviewing people, making a preliminary tour to look for rational explanations. Then, when all this is done, there comes the trip to the house for the investigation, which could end up being nothing more than hours of silent boredom with poor results. One channel that I appreciate is Dead Cold Paranormal. Because I'm not in England, I enjoy his episodes because he talks about the land, what was there prior to the current building and location that he's investigating. And I personally believe that is important. Just because you're going to a house or building that is standing there now, there has been so much more that has happened on that particular area when you consider the thousands or hundreds of thousands of years that people have been around. There could have been huts there before, different businesses. Because I read about a lot of ancient civilizations, I'm aware that in a lot of locations, you have buildings built on top of each other, and as you go down the layers, you discover more about the civilizations that were there previously. So I really do feel that Knowing the history of an area, whether you do that before or after an investigation, is important because that may give you some of the answers to the different things that you may experience. I believe this comment on page 164 is also important because it clearly states you're spending hours and you may catch nothing. In fact, it's quite common to catch nothing. As any of the investigators, the real investigators that I watch, will comment in their videos. I used to love the original start to the Ouija brothers, and they had right up there, warning, real paranormal investigation, nothing may happen. And I think that's very important for viewers to understand. If you're watching a channel that every single week is at a different location, every single week they catch something, most of them catch 3 or 4 over the top somethings, then you really need to ask yourself, what are the odds? If it was that easy to capture, do you not think that at this point science would have some explanation for that? If you watch the real investigators, you'll notice more often than not, there aren't captures. They'll talk about what has happened, whether it's a knock or a bang. They'll give explanations. Sometimes it's a loose window or air currents. And I'm referring to the people on YouTube. They're going to abandoned different locations. Not everyone's paying hundreds to thousands of dollars to stay at a building with a reputation. So, of course, there's going to be different factors that come into play. Another great quote from this book is by one of Richard Palmisano's fellow investigators, because he works with a team. It's on page 143. John Mullen says, "It's like dust particles floating around the room. You can't see them, but regardless, they are still there. When you catch a sunbeam shining in through a window, the floating dust is suddenly illuminated." I believe that sums up the paranormal perfectly. People are always saying, well, you can't see it, or you didn't capture it on video, or whatever the 101 plus reasons are. And this comparison to dust particles is perfect because we know dust particles are real. When you see the sun shining in, you can see them floating through. People recognize that sometimes orbs aren't orbs, they're just dust particles, and you can tell that by closing the curtains, what have you. It doesn't mean that the dust particles don't exist, they're still there. So this thing about you can't see a ghost, therefore it doesn't exist, just doesn't cut it for me. It may for other people. Another point that I'd like to make, and this goes back to page 164 actually, this comment is another clue about whether you're watching real paranormal or paranormal for entertainment purposes. Keeping in mind that investigation is work, and that work isn't just finding a location and going to it. As I mentioned, there's the long hours, there's the research into the property, there's talking to people if you're doing a home investigation, or talking to tour guides if you're doing an investigation in a different type of building. But the other part that goes with that is an investigator has to know a little bit about a lot of things: physics, general science, electronics, human psychology, physiology, history, parapsychology, paranormal theory, photography, how sound works, works, how light works, investigative techniques, report writing, and the workings of all equipment you may have to use, to name a few. Those areas I believe are crucial. If you've seen my previous video, I mentioned my background in psychology and a course that I've taken in parapsychology. I'm still learning about photography, and if you've seen that video, I put up 2 pictures of the Tower of London. One, some people will think is an orb. It isn't actually, it's the flash of my camera when I was taking the picture of my picture. That's why knowing about photography and your equipment is important. It's also an area where the debunkers are especially helpful because they know about editing techniques, how you can create certain visual and audio effects. So it really is helpful to watch the debunking channels if you're wondering about a particular paranormal channel that you're watching. All of these points that Richard Palmisano makes are important if you're thinking about getting into paranormal investigating, and especially if you're doing paranormal investigating and talking to the general public about that, because people are going to listen to what you're saying. And if you're not up to date on what's going on in the paranormal field, and there are, quite frankly, a number of different agencies and organizations that are made up of scientists and other people as well who are trying to find answers for this. And as I've already mentioned, if you're watching a channel that is constantly over the top with finding evidence, again, ask yourself if it's that easy that 52 weeks of the year you can put up a video where you have capture after capture after capture, why would this still not be explained by science? You don't need to be strong in editing skills to start recognizing the clues that you're watching clickbait. Now, if you're watching it for entertainment, that's different. As I mentioned in my previous video, I watched Supernatural. It's a program I enjoyed. It's not real paranormal, but it was entertainment. I'm stressing these different points and about being mindful of the type of paranormal content you're watching because sadly, and because I follow the debunking community, that there are people who believe some of this clickbait nonsense is real, and they're sending money, sometimes sadly money they don't have to spare, to support people who could honestly care less about them because they're just in it for the clicks and views. They're not in it to promote or support the paranormal research and community. They're in it for the bottom line dollar. So just please be mindful if before you're sending your money, do some of your own research into the channels and their content and what is it that they're presenting. Journeys into the Unknown does provide a lot of great information. There's some interesting ghost stories in the beginning. He goes on to talk about the investigations that he has done with his group. They're called the Searcher Group. At the end, and again, this isn't something I've ever seen on a YouTube paranormal video, the book ends with forms that investigators should be completing, including one that keeps promoting itself as serious research. And they talk about their different tools and things, but even they don't seem to keep paper recording. The book ends with forms, so whether you're working as part of a paranormal team or an investigator on your own, you really should be keeping records. Because if you're working to try and prove or understand the paranormal, The best way to do that is by going back and looking at your records, whether you do them old school on paper or you keep a file on your computer in word processing or set up a chart on something like Excel for the location with the information. There's lots of ways to keep your data and pull that information together. So we have a data collection form. He also includes an interview form because, again, keeping in mind, in this case, his team goes to do investigations at private homes. So you want to interview the people who have witnessed the phenomena, who live in the home, and what have their experiences been. Was there more than one witness? How often do the events occur? It's important to keep that in mind, and I'm thinking of one despicable channel in particular. Hauntings do not always last for years. In fact, many of the cases that I've read only occur over certain periods. If you've seen my definition of poltergeist in my previous video and how that is explained, that's where all this confusion about not having a set definition for things just muddies and complicates the waters. For example, can you imagine what astronomy would be like and how far behind we would be right now if not for the fact that astronomers have a set definition for the different items? For example, like what a comet is, every astronomer agrees what that is. What is a meteorite? Again, all astronomers agree that's what this is. Unfortunately, when it comes to the paranormal, it's a mishmash and free reign. So it would be very helpful if, whether you're an investigator or a researcher, there was a set agreed upon definition of what is a ghost, what is a poltergeist, etc. The author goes on to talk about different theories regarding ghosts and their existence. It's an interesting read, and one that I found particularly interesting was the concept of clusters. He has a great diagram here. So, based on this theory, you have a location and it starts with one ghost. As I mentioned earlier, things change, houses are built on previous houses, etc. And of course, different events happen there. So, with each of those happenings, there are, of course, new ghosts, new spirits, and they congregate with the older spirits. And so the group begins to grow. That, of course, is assuming that some of the spirits don't go into the light, if you believe in such things. And these spirits stay there, and their information base accumulates because as they communicate with each other, they always get the latest bit of information. So you could have a group of spirits spanning centuries, and if there's one who has recently passed, they would share all the different information there. It was an interesting concept because I know when I'm watching different videos, people will say, well, humans have been around for so long. Why don't you ever capture energy or spirits of the dinosaurs or cavemen, etc.? That in turn brings up, how long do spirits stay here? Is it once you're earthbound, you're always earthbound? Or is there some point in time, because again, keeping in mind, energy is never destroyed, it changes. So do they become something other than a ghost? Do ghosts exist forever? It's, yeah, something that can really spiral out and make you wonder. Throughout the book, he also talks about memory bubbles is another concept. And on page 148, it's defined as a memory bubble is a reality created by an individual spirit in which it exists. The bubble matrix consists of a period in time and space familiar to the individual when they were living. So for that spirit, what they see is what they experienced during their lifetime. For me, this also brings up or makes me think about now all the different theories about different dimensions and the fact that sometimes when you see spirits and they're walking above the floor, we perceive them as floating above the floor, but in their dimension, they're walking on a floor. It's just that the dimensions, for whatever reason, in that blip of time, you've been able to see through. And I am looking forward to the day when someday some of this begins to be not just more accepted, but explained. So as scientists continue to look at the different dimensions and parallel universes, when I was growing up, it was referred to as the universe. Over the last number of years, it is now referred to as the multiverse because they are aware there is not just our one universe expanding, there are so many others. Some days I just personally can't go there because as a kid, I found it overwhelming to think there was a universe expanding, and the big question always was, what is it expanding into? What is it going to happen? What's going to happen? Now, with the multiverse and who knows what's all out there, it can just become extremely overwhelming some days. If you're interested in reading about a paranormal investigator's perspective, learning about different equipment and how to do an investigation, I definitely recommend Journeys into the Unknown, 101 Ways to Find a Ghost, Essential Tools, Tips, and Techniques to Uncover Paranormal Activity. This is by Melissa Martin Ellis. She is a member of the Rhode Island Paranormal Research Group and the American Association of Electronic Voice Phenomena. She's captured mysterious images on film in various locales around New England, including the Lizzie Borden House in Fall River, Massachusetts. So ghost hunting expert Melissa Martin Ellis has seen, felt, and sensed it all. Now, thanks to 101 Ways to Find a Ghost, you too can part the veil between us and the mysterious world on the other side. I want to stop there for a moment because quite often, and as we're now coming up to Halloween, people talk about this thinning of the veil, and it's the best time to connect with ghosts and spirits. For a while, I thought there may be something to that, but now I really question that. Let me know in the comments down below. Do you believe there's some type of veil between the worlds and that there's a time of year when it gets thinner? And here's why I question that. Right now in the Northern Hemisphere, which is where I live, we're coming up to Halloween. And as I say, people talk about this thinning of the veil and an increase in ghostly activity. But in the Southern Hemisphere, it's the exact opposite time of year. So the whole Earth is not currently coming up to this thinning of the veil time. And the reason that I'm questioning that is because, like I say, I'm going to get my little globe type thing. So I have my little serpentine globe. Here's the point that I'm making. And yes, I'm aware our Earth tilts a little bit that way. So right now, here in the Northern Hemisphere, we're coming up to Halloween. But in the Southern Hemisphere, it's the complete opposite. So why would only half of the Earth have a thinning of the veil while the other half doesn't. And this is very different from, and it comes up in one of the other books that I've read. There's always this question of, why do paranormal investigators go out at nighttime? And I have to be honest, it's something that I've also questioned, because I believe the ghost spirits are around 24/7. You're not just going to capture them at night. Now, one comment that I have heard, and it makes sense as well, things are quieter at night. Typically, if, like me, you live in the city, that sadly isn't always the case, and there's constant people movement, especially now in 2023, as people are out and about 24/7. That may be a factor in terms of trying to cut down on some of the noise pollution when you're investigating different locations. And that makes sense, quite frankly. The other factor is a number of people who get into investigations also have full-time jobs. So for them, getting out at night is the only time that they can get out and do that. And a number of the people in these paranormal investigation groups do it all on a volunteer basis. In other words, they're not getting paid for going out to do this. They're doing it on their own time. Again, we're using my serpentine example of the Earth. The sun's coming this way. So on this side of the globe, we're all experiencing daytime, but that's around that whole section. On this side, which is facing out into space, they're experiencing nighttime. Part of what would be different on this side is that they're not getting the interference from the sun. And that could be another factor in getting different captures. So doing the investigation at night may make more sense, because when you're considering EMFs and all the different things that come in from the sun, that in turn could also have an impact on your equipment. So it does make sense from that perspective to do investigations at night. Whether you want to track down and record spirits, or you're just intrigued as to whether or not these phantasms really do exist, Ellis will guide your exploration of paranormal activity. It's easier than ever to detect and even communicate with ghosts, if you're prepared for what you may find. I had this book for a number of years before I finally read it. I really am glad that I did. I enjoyed the read. She covers so many wonderful things. This particular book was published in 2011 by Adams Media. And I like to mention the dates because in 2026, the equipment and the apps were different than they were in 2011, and certainly different now in 2023. Going back to read the older books is a great way to see how how the paranormal field has changed, different techniques and tools that people are using now compared to what they began with earlier in the field. I'll get into that more when I do Talking to the Dead by George Newery and Rosemary Ellen Guiley. 101 Ways is broken into 10 different parts. So in part 1, she has Be Prepared, Things to Keep in Mind. Part 2 is Ghosts, Spirits and Entities, Haunts and Hotspots. Part 3, In the Field, Practical Skills and Work on Location. Part 4, Analysis and Review of Evidence. Part 5 is about psychic skills, so sensitive to the supernatural. Part 6 is about self-defense and protection. And again, that's not something that very many of the paranormal investigators that I've seen on YouTube talk about. Part 7, investigative work, so doing research and legalities. Part 9 is about gear and technology, so the equipment. Part 9 is about teamwork, and again, keeping in mind that this author was part of a team and they did investigations in their local area. Part 10 is about ghost hunting as a hobby or a profession. At the back of the book, she has 4 different appendix. So the first is about the most haunted sites in America. B are the famous ghosts. C, which I just talked about earlier, is a glossary, which is very handy because, again, people have different terms for what the words mean. Poltergeist, the famous noisy ghost, a rare form of haunting wherein random objects are moved and sounds and speech are produced by unseen entities, which seem to crave attention and recognition. Frequently, a child or adolescent is at the center of the phenomena. So in her definition, she does mention about a child or adolescent. As I mentioned in my video with the definitions, adults can generate poltergeists as well. It's about that transition, strong emotions, difficult situations that end up manifesting as you're pushing your energy out and things happen around you. And again, as I stressed in my video, that is unconscious. So whether it's a child, adult, or an adolescent, the activity is not generated consciously or on purpose. Her definition does at least include part of that concept. She just doesn't come out and say psychokinesis. But she does have it defined below: a paranormal phenomena in which objects are moved solely by the powers of the psychic's mind. I personally don't think you need to be psychic, but I guess that depends on your different interpretations. So the glossary is a great section because it lets you know how she defines those terms. And then, of course, she has a bibliography, so the different books that she referred to when putting her own book together. Now, in her book, and on page 1, she says, a ghost hunter, also known as a paranormal investigator, seeks to collect data concerning paranormal activity in places reported to be haunted. The general goal is to investigate, research, and document evidence of paranormal activity. There's so much more than just going out with a camera and doing some captures. Unless, of course, you're just making a video based on paranormal activity. If, on the other hand, you're doing actual research to try and promote understanding what the paranormal is, then record keeping and detailed record keeping is crucial. A video alone is not proof. She also makes an important point on page 3. Your credibility as a paranormal investigator relies on maintaining your objectivity. Critics and skeptics believe that most ghost hunters are unreliable. Ghost hunters are often labeled fantasy-prone personalities. This is why it is so important to consider what you're doing, what you're saying, and what you're claiming. Whether it's in your own community or whether it's to your audience on YouTube or other social media, what you're saying and what you're presenting has big consequences. And that comes up often on debunking channels and how the fake paranormal impacts individuals, not just in their pocketbook, but their mental health, their businesses. There is a massive ripple effect. Some people say, well, so and so just started faking it because, they're trying to make money, but they're a really nice person. For myself, if you're a nice person, you're not grifting, you're not taking advantage, and you're not outright lying to people. Because the bottom line is, if you're faking, you're faking and you're putting it out there as real paranormal. So you're impacting your audience, you're impacting the field of the paranormal, you're impacting other paranormal investigators and researchers. Again, it's being mindful of what you're putting out there and what you're saying, because whether you believe it or not, and whether, like me, you just have a small channel or you're a big channel, the fact is someone is watching, they're having conversations with other people, so you have an impact on the field in general. Another point that she makes on page 3, your standard operating procedure should include keeping scrupulous records and honoring client commitments and confidentiality while looking for normal, everyday explanations of phenomena. The key there is confidentiality, and that's something that sadly Hollywood has no concept of. I watched it happen with the Amityville house and the number of different things that were happening back then after the movie came out and the location was discovered. And again, as I've said in an earlier video, that all happened prior to social media. So it took a bit longer for the information to get out there, but it still happened. The most current situation is the Conjuring house. And again, Hollywood, for whatever reason, decided to mention where that house is. And although there are people who will pay, the last I heard it was $750 a night to investigate. There are others who either don't have the money or who aren't interested in spending the money. I've watched videos by 2 of the previous owners of that property. Now, I've had someone tell me that's false. I'm going to trust the 2 homeowners, and both of them have said they've given up the property because of trespassers. It was people showing up at all hours. The gentleman shared that he has PTSD and he was afraid of what might happen some night if these people were creeping around. It's really why I don't understand humans. I mean, I get that you don't want to pay the $750. That's a big chunk of change. I certainly don't have that kind of money to put out for one night. But on the other hand, if it's paranormal investigating you're interested in, there are lots of locations that don't cost anything. In part 6, she talks about self-defense and protection. And again, this isn't something that I've seen come up on very many paranormal channels. And when I say paranormal channels, I'm referring to real paranormal. So the people like Ouija Brothers and Dead Cold Paranormal. Paranormal activity can range from harmless residual hauntings to potentially harmful poltergeists and malevolent entities. You and your team will want to be prepared for your first encounter with malevolent or inhuman spirits. Thoroughly research the topic and use whatever spiritual protection you deem appropriate. Now, when she's talking about a harmful poltergeist, that again is going by her definition of noisy spirit. Do agree that if you're going out, before you start doing any of this, you really should be researching what are you getting into. And if you've noticed thus far, I haven't mentioned the D word. It certainly isn't what the clickbait make it out to be, and I'm just not going down that road. I'll get into the D word in a different video. More often than not, to capture real paranormal activity is rare. So to think that it's coming up all the time is nonsense. If someone's going through that experience, it's not the garbage portrayed by the clickbait channels or who throw that word up in their thumbnail for the sake of views and clicks. People who are experiencing situations that could be by a dark or evil, nasty spirit, whatever you want to call it, if they're watching that garbage, that's just going to make their life and the situation so much worse. And this is why I wish there was some kind of centralized group that people could reach out to and get accurate, honest information where they know they're not going to be taken advantage of, and where there's a group of people who are honestly and sincerely wanting to help and provide support. That's just me. I think before some of the answers are going to happen, you need to have that community, that place where people who are going through actual paranormal events can turn to and trust that they're going to be taken seriously and that they're not going to be taken advantage of. In terms of protecting yourself, she has a number of ideas, and for many people, that's going to depend on your personal beliefs, whether you follow a certain religious or spiritual path, what you consider spirits and other things to be. She talks about psychic attacks, and again, that's something that you have to consider. There's an important point she makes here on page 100. All psychics agree that allowing yourself to be intimidated is the worst possible response, as fear opens a point of vulnerability that can be further exploited. Once the primal emotion of fear is triggered, the entity has a handle it can use to do further damage. So this is where it's important, whether you believe in doing white light, whether you do Reiki and you use that energy to protect you. Up there, I have an aura cleanser, so it's just a spritz that I use to keep things positive. You could carry crystals. There's so many different things that you can do. Some people wear bracelets, some people wear necklaces, some people have tattoos. The point is, be mindful and be aware. There are some investigators that I've heard say, well, they don't believe in attachments, so they disregard it. There are others who, a few have mentioned different jewelry that they wear or different things that they do prior to starting an investigation, whether that's just saying a quiet prayer, protecting themselves in white light. So that's very much up to the individual. And of course, it's going to be impacted by what you believe as well as why you're making the video. Is it entertainment only, in which case you're not going to take any of this seriously, or are you seriously trying to help the paranormal field? She talks about a variety of the different equipment. She talks about EVPs, energy fields. There's a lot of great information if you're looking at getting into investigating. In the final section of the book, she's talking about ghost hunting as a hobby or a profession. And people do it as both. And not everybody who is involved in this type of work has a YouTube channel. In fact, there are many groups who aren't on social media. They work in their own area as a small group of people. Sometimes, like this author, they're part of a paranormal research group and others. Whether you're a pro or a hobbyist, you need to maintain a good reputation. Serious ghost hunters must keep very careful track of the information they uncover during investigations. Lone investigators and organizations alike share the same obligation to the client and the rest of the paranormal community to keep good records and share non-confidential data that will lead to a greater understanding of the phenomena observed for all researchers in the field. A high standard of professionalism preserves the reputation and integrity of the group. What you're saying and what you're doing is impacting not just you, but the field in general. It's important that, again, whether you're doing this as a hobby, whether you're doing it as a profession, whether you're part of a team or you're working alone, be professional, be mindful of the information that you're sharing, how you're sharing it, who you're sharing it with. Maintain confidentiality. After all, how would you feel if someone decided to put your address up there and all of a sudden you've got a bunch of people showing up at your door? I'm pretty sure you wouldn't enjoy it very much. Maybe that's the other part to this. If you're not the one having the experience, try to put yourself in the shoes of someone who is going through this. And what they're looking for is some help and answers. They're not looking to be part of your YouTube channel necessarily. I mean, after all, that's the other part that I'm not really hearing people talk about. These clickbait channels have people who are pushing that narrative with them, especially when they're pretending to be at a home that's haunted and they're interviewing the person and everyone knows the video's fake. So unfortunately, it isn't just the clickbait content creators, it's the people who are pretending to be in haunted houses that are also pushing this false narrative. The more that people collect together, if you've seen my debunking video and starfish, I do think we'll eventually get there one starfish at a time. It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of effort from a variety of different groups, not just the debunkers. It'll take researchers and investigators and debunkers all uniting, putting something together that, as I say, people can reach out to and know they're going to be taken seriously and get the help and support that they're looking for.